So welcome everybody to another Monday night, for me Monday night class on some basic topics in Hasidic thought. And like always, I'll try to connect the topic both to psychology and to the Parsha. So this week it's actually, it all hinges on the name of the Parsha, Kitisa. Kitisa literally means when you count. Really, that's what the non-literal meaning is. That when you come to count the Jewish people, you should do it in a certain way, by having each of them give half of a shekel, half of the common type of coin that was used at the time. But the word literally means to lift, to raise. And the meaning here of to raise has to be understood. It's not a simple. Why would you use the word to raise something in order to say to count? So there's a lot of interpretations offered. And we're going to use this word to go into what is probably, from a philosophical and psychological point of view, maybe the most important innovation of Hasidic thought. And the ramifications that this has for our psychology are just infinite. It's hard to count them all. But it really changes a lot of what we think about ourselves and what we think about our place in the world and what exactly is possible and what does it mean to be healthy and many other things. A lot of this won't come as a complete surprise to us who are living in the 21st century. But you have to remember that when the Baal Shem Tov suggested this almost 300 years ago, it was way beyond cutting edge. It was nothing short of a revolution in Judaism, in philosophy. There was almost no way to contain what he was saying about these things. So, again, for us, some of these ideas may be well known. Some of them may be things that we already live with, that we incorporate into our lives in different ways. But I think that even if that's the case, there's still a lot to be learned about the sources of these ideas and exactly how to apply them. So let's start. The way I want to start is, I want to explain how else this word raise, kitisa, when you raise, can be understood. Now, there's a philosophical term in Hebrew which is called nesiat hafachim. And it's a difficult term to trace down. When exactly did it originate? Where did it come from? It literally means carrying opposites. Two things that are opposite. So, one maybe first example that comes right away to mind is the blessing that we say sometimes a few times a day. We certainly say it in the morning, which is Rofeh kol basar umafli la'asot, that God heals all flesh and he performs miracles. And what is the miracle that we're referring to? We say this blessing when we wake up, after we go to the restroom. We also say this blessing every other time that we go to the restroom. And we come out. And this blessing is basically thanking God for the fact that our bodies work the way that they do. So what is the wonder exactly that we're blessing him for? What are we saying this over? It's explained that the blessing is for the paradox of our existence. Human existence is at its core a paradox. How so? Because we are a soul, which is entirely spiritual, living contained within a physical body. And though the spiritual and the physical should not be able to interact, let alone stick together for 70 to 120 years, that's the wonder that God does. This wonder, the word wonder itself, became a synonym in many places in Hasidic thought for paradox. That when we say that something is a wonder, what we're saying is that expect a paradox. Expect two things that are opposite to be able to be together. Now, paradoxes take on a lot of different faces. They come in various different forms and various different ways. The paradox in this week's Parsha is explained in Chassidus to have to do with the fact, for instance, that we're only giving half of a shekel, half of that amount that we were commanded to give for the tabernacle. And who's giving the other half? So there's an understanding that it's God who's giving the other half. He's like completing what we do. That would also seem to be a type of paradox, because what exactly does that mean? How can an infinite being connect with a finite being? How do you connect the finite with the infinite? But the point that the Baal Shem Tov made is that not only is human existence at its core a paradox that contains both the spiritual and the physical, but for the Jew, for the Jewish soul, the paradox is much greater. It's not just between the spiritual and the physical being contained together and living together and cooperating, but rather every Jew is in that same type of relationship with the Almighty. And that creates the paradox of the infinite and the finite working together. And again, that's captured in the image of giving half a shekel, and it's as if God gives the other half. But as paradoxes go, it doesn't end there, but rather the understanding is that we give a half and God gives the whole. In a certain sense, it's not that God fills the missing half, because that would be finite and finite. Rather, we give something that's finite, symbolized by the half. God makes it infinite, symbolized by the whole. And so we have a paradox that's not only in the cooperation between the two, but in the transformation that happens to our contribution. And this is, when you think about it, the core of Jewish existence. Because the core of Jewish existence is that we are partners with God in making the world what it needs to be. That God created the world in such a way that we would become the partners. There's many, many sayings by the sages about this, and they all have to do with God saying at the end of creation all that God had created in order to do, la'asot. And what is that to do? The sages explain that anyone who does so and so becomes a partner with God in creation. Anybody who does X, Y, and Z becomes a partner with God in creation. What are these things that we're supposed to do? These are the mitzvot. These are the commandments. And the understanding is that by contributing a finite action, we're actually becoming paradoxically partners with the infinite creator. And that is the substrate that guides all of Jewish practice. Everything in the Torah is understood that way. That it's not just that we're trying to build a good human life, but we understand it as part of the creation process itself. That part of it was delegated somehow from the infinite into the finite realm and was entrusted to us. And thus we become the bridge that holds the connection between the finite and the infinite. So this is a very basic idea that in Hasidic thought, and again, it's not just based on Hasidic thought, this idea of God performing a wonder by connecting the body and the soul together, and the notion that we become partners in creation with God. These are as old as all of the oral tradition. We'll see as we go on, hopefully if we have time, we'll see a few verses in the Bible that talk about these types of paradox, meaning that they're not just part of the oral tradition, they're actually in the Bible in a number of different places, and we'll look at that. But what I want to do now is I want to spend the first part of our meeting today talking about paradox in general. I want to get a better feel for what paradoxes are about. And as we move through the different examples, I want to get to the notion of paradox as a power. And that's why I called the lecture Our Secret Power, or maybe I should have called it Our Superpower. And really, when you capture the notion of a paradox and what it can do in the psyche and what it can do in your life, you may realize that we've been endowed with a secret superpower that can change and allow us to do things that might seem, well, paradoxical, unimaginable, things that you wouldn't normally think that you could do. And in the psyche, this becomes essential. It's part of what we call in Chassidus the run and return, or the pulse of the soul's life. And the pulse here is the ability to move between two sides of different paradoxes. Okay, so let's look at the first and simplest type of paradox. This is probably one of the most ancient that was developed. And it's called the liar paradox. The liar paradox says, well, in its old form, the way it was said in Greece, was all Cretans are liars. And so you meet a Cretan, somebody from Crete, and he says, I'm not a liar. So is he or isn't he? The way this was developed further, and this is how we're going to tackle it because it better serves our purpose, it's the same idea. It was stated as, imagine that we have a sentence. You can write it down to see it, because sometimes paradoxes are a little tricky. They might evade you in the beginning. But this one's pretty simple. So imagine that you're writing down the sentence, and just maybe write it down. This sentence is false. So just write down those 4 words. This sentence is false. So let's follow the logic of this sentence is false. And let's call it sentence A, okay? So we could just write A, colon, this sentence is false, or sentence A is false. If A is true, meaning if this sentence is false is a true statement, then what is it saying about itself? It's saying that it's false. But if it's false, then what happens to the statement? This statement is false. Well, two negatives make a positive. So to say that this statement is false is like saying this statement is true. So the statement's truth value, as we call it, just flipped. And instead of being false, as we assumed it was in the beginning because the statement was true, it's now become false because now the statement is true. And if you keep following the logic of this, you'll see that you enter into an infinite loop. And each time that you revisit the truth value of the statement, it will flip. So it starts out being true, and then it becomes false, goes back to being true, and turning back to false, and so on. So this is the simplest, or second simplest version of the liar paradox, as it's called. Why? Because the statement is basically assumed to be a liar, because it's saying it's false. But the moment you assume that it's not saying something false, then it flips, and so on. Now, why did I started with this example, the liar paradox? Because really the question is, so is this statement true or false? Which is it? And you can never give an answer, because each time you try to answer, well, if you follow the logic, like I said, it's going to flip. But there's something even more important in this example. And it's that it highlights the fact that paradoxes can lead to energy. Let's call it energy. And what do I mean by energy? Well, the attempt to try to answer the question, is this statement actually true or is it false, leads you to keep questioning. It leads you into a cycle. Now, some people would give up because, well, whether this statement is true or false is not very interesting. So if you've been through the cycle once or twice, you got the point, and you're probably not going to continue on. But let's take the paradox of human existence, which we said is being both spiritual and physical. So which is it? Am I spiritual or am I physical? A paradox like that, on the face of it, doesn't lead you into a loop. But if you think about paradox using the liar paradox, you might come to the conclusion that being physical and being spiritual could act in the same way. Meaning, I could start out with the supposition that I am physical. But then certain things in my life push me in the direction that I'm spiritual. So then I question myself, which is it? Am I physical or spiritual? I might say now I'm spiritual. But then as life continues, I'm forced to acknowledge my physical side. And instead of saying, well, maybe I'm a little spiritual and a little physical, I could replace that type of thinking with saying that I am wholly spiritual, entirely spiritual, and when that plays out fully, I become physical again. And when that plays out fully, I go back to being spiritual. Using paradox, a state of paradox in that way, can create a dynamic in the psyche and in the soul that keeps you on your toes, that doesn't let you just get away with the simple answer that I'm spiritual and physical. Because as Hasidus argues, if you end up saying that, well, my soul is spiritual, my body is physical, that doesn't answer the question of what are you? What is your identity? Is your identity physical or is your identity spiritual? And when it comes to identity, you can't just get away with saying, well, I have a split identity. You have to completely identify with something. So if I'm identifying with my physical side, then I'm not identifying at the same time with my spiritual side. But then, of course, I do have a spiritual side. So after a few moments, that might flip. And now I identify with my spiritual side. And then I identify with my physical side. And I keep going through this. Now, on the face of it, somebody would say, well, what good is that? We'll see in a moment how much benefit that can bring to life, to living. I want to make a small note that before returning to paradox in and of itself, that there was a Christian theologian, his name was Jerome of Stridon, and he's most famous, he lived in the 5th century, and he's most famous for translating the Bible, or most of the Bible, into Latin. He wrote the Vulgate, as it's called, the Vulgata, as we say in the academic world. So he looked for the liar paradox. Since he translated the Bible, I guess he knew most of it. And he says he found the liar paradox inside a verse. And which verse is this? It's a verse that we say every Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of each month, when we read the Hallel. And the words in Hebrew are Ani amarti b'chofzi kol ha'adam kozev, which literally means, I said in my rashness, all men are false. And so Jerome, he concluded from this that King David, who wrote Psalms, was playing on the liar paradox. Why? Because if all men are false, meaning they all are deceitful, then why isn't David, who's writing this, also deceitful? So, can you trust what he says? Or should you not trust what he says? So he claims this is an example of the liar paradox. Of course, it's a completely incorrect reading, because David doesn't claim that all men are always deceitful. He's not saying that we're all deceitful all the time. He's just saying all men have the vice of being deceitful. We may not know when they're saying a lie and when they're not, but we've all fallen in that respect and we've all said lies. That's very different than saying all men are always deceitful, in which case you can't count and you can't trust David himself. So that's just an aside of how important paradox is, and how it might appear, or how a Christian theologian tried to find it in the Bible. We'll show in a moment where it does exist in the Bible in a very clear and evident way. But one thing that I want to mention about this is that the sages, when they read this verse, that all men are deceitful, they built on this a very important medrash, a very important homily. And they write like this: when God came to create man, the ministering angels were divided into groups. Some of them said he should not be created, and some of them said he should be created. Say the sages, this is the meaning of the verse: loving kindness and truth met, justice and peace kissed. This is a verse from Psalms 85. What does this mean? Loving kindness, the name of one angel, said he should be created. Why should he be created? Because man performs acts of loving kindness. But truth said he should not be created. Why? For he is all lies. For all men are deceitful. The same idea. So you have this interesting paradox above, that when God comes to, as it were, take counsel from the ministering angels, they come to him and they say, well, some of us think he should be created, some of us think he shouldn't be created. So that's like a paradox. How did God solve this paradox? Very interesting. He just created man. While they were arguing between them, he created man. So you can get from this paradox, like it's a cute understanding. But another thing you can get from it is that paradoxes are the basis of mankind. But maybe even more importantly than that, paradoxes are the fire, they're the energy, the fuel behind creativity. Meaning that when God came to create man, one of the things this Medrash is saying is that man was created on the basis, on the fuel of paradox. It's almost like the creativity needed to make man was this paradox, this paradoxical state that was sustained by God between these two groups of angels. Those saying he should be created and those arguing that he shouldn't be created. Let's continue on to another famous paradox. And again, this is a Greek paradox. And in a moment we'll say something about why these are all Greek paradoxes. Xenos paradox. Xenos paradox is very famous. He had a number of them to demonstrate the same idea. But the simplest one that most people know is that you can never get an arrow to hit the target. If you shoot an arrow from point A, it will never strike point B. Now we all know that that's not true because arrows do hit the target eventually. So how did Xenos show that that won't happen? Well, he said very simply, from A to B, there's a distance. And to traverse that distance, at any moment, the arrow only traverses a finite amount of space, a finite distance. But from A to B, into how many finite pieces can you divide the distance? Says Zeno, you can divide them into an infinite number of spaces. And since it takes a finite amount of time to traverse each small segment, each infinitesimally small segment, it should take an infinite amount of time because there is an infinite number of segments to get from point A to point B. Hence, the arrow can never arrive at its target. Now, Zeno made up these paradoxes because he wanted to challenge our notion of space and time. That was his real purpose. And he was asking a very basic question to which he didn't have an answer. The question was, should you think of space and time as infinitely divisible? Is that really true? So in his paradox, he tried to show that it's basically not true. But that was a little difficult to swallow for many people. Why would it be difficult to swallow? Well, there were atomists, for instance. There were Greeks who thought that all matter was made up of infinitely small atoms. And if they're infinitely small, then Zeno's paradox is a real problem for them. Because space has to be infinitely divisible in order to contain something that's infinitely small. And if that's true, then the arrow really can't make the entire distance from point A to point B in a finite amount of time. So these were very interesting paradoxes that hit at the core of what do space and time look like? What are they really like? So we since then have had all kinds of different answers. I want to read what the answer of the sages is. They're not going to address the question directly, but they're going to give an answer, or at least a description from which we can learn a lot. It says, and very interestingly, this has to do with Purim that we just came out of. And here in Yerushalayim, we had Purim yesterday for a bunch of reasons. But we had the Seudah, we had the festive meal yesterday. And in the tractate Megillah, in the Babylonian Talmud, which describes the laws of Purim and everything that has to do with it, there's a very interesting statement, and I'll read it for you. Rabbi Levi said, "This is a matter of tradition that we received from our ancestors." This is on page 10, folio 10, page B. "The place of the Ark of the Covenant is not included in the measurement of the Holy of Holies in which it rested." What does that mean? They say like this, the Gemara explains, the Talmud explains. It was taught in a Braita, it was taught in another statement. The ark crafted by Moses had 10 cubits of empty space on each side. And it is written in the description of Solomon's temple, and before the sanctuary, which was 20 cubits in length and 20 cubits in breadth. So the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, was 20 cubits in length and 20 cubits in width. The ark itself was 1.5 by 2.5 cubits. But, says the Talmud, when you say before the sanctuary, you're talking about the place where the ark is, because that's what makes the sanctuary a sanctuary, the holiness of the ark. So from this they learned, and it is written, there's a verse that describes this, and the wing of one of the cherubs was 10 cubits, and the wing of the other cherub was 10 cubits, and the wings of the cherubs occupied the entire area. This is from Kings 6:20. 1 Kings. If so, where was the ark itself standing? There's only 20 cubits. So you've got these two cherubs with huge wings. These are not the cherubs that were on the ark. These are cherubs that Solomon made. They were big. And they had outstretched wings that each one was 5 cubits. So they were in total 10 cubits. And they filled the entire sanctuary. The understanding is that there was no room for the ark. So where is the ark itself standing? Says the Talmud, rather, we must conclude from this that the ark stood by means of a miracle and occupied no space. What does this mean? The commentaries try to explain what's going on here. What do you mean it's not occupying any space? The ark's there. So they say it works like this. The cherubs, the big cherubs that Solomon made, one was on the left side, one was on the right side of the ark. And their wings touched. So, what does it mean that they touched? It means that if you went from one side of the sanctuary and you measured till the ark, you would measure like the wings of the cherub, 10 cubits. And then if you went to the other side of the sanctuary and you measured to the ark, you would again see that the wings filled the entire gap. So there were 10 cubits from the other side to the ark. If that's what's going on, then how can you have 10 from one side to the arc and 10 from another side to the arc? But the arc itself is a 1.5 by 2.5 cubits in width and length. So how is it fitting in there? There's no more room left. But you just measured to the arc. The sages say, the commentaries say on this, that this is the source of paradox in space. This is the ultimate paradox that existed in the temple. Beyond being a place of worship, the temple was meant to be the place where you actually saw, you could see it with your eyes, you could measure it, you could be convinced physically that we live in a paradox. That our very existence, not just our own, is spiritual and physical, but the very existence of space and time is paradoxical. The answer, according to Torah, to Xeno's paradoxes is, Xeno, you're right and you're wrong. You're both. Space can be divided infinitely, and yet you can still traverse an infinite number of finite segments in a finite amount of time. And conversely, time can also be divided into an infinite number of moments, and yet you can get in time from where you are now to where you'll be in an hour, even though you've traversed an infinite number of moments in between. And this becomes the paradox, the very paradox at the core of physical existence, not just of our psychological and intellectual existence, but it's built into the fabric of reality. Why? Because reality is, on the one hand, God in his infinite nature creating a finite reality. And yet that finite reality is not outside of God. So you have something finite within the infinite. That's a paradox. But you could also think of it the other way around. That when man discovers God, so he's bringing the infinite into the finite. It works both ways. The finite creation is what God created within his infinite being. That's the relationship from God to creation. That's one side of the paradox. And the other side of it's already a paradox in and of itself, because the finite cannot exist within the infinite. It should also be infinite. There's no room for finiteness within the infinite. And vice versa, the other side, the other paradox is that finite reality, like in the temple, contains a presence of the infinite creator. And so the finite contains the infinite. These are paradoxes at the core of Jewish faith. Now, we have to take one step back before we continue. And that is that many Hasidic masters explained that the war against the Greeks in the time of Hanukkah, the time of the Hashmonaim, the Maccabees, was a war over whether or not to accept paradox or not. The Greek mind, which is logical, could not sustain paradox. There was no way to sustain a paradox. A paradox was considered to be ludicrous. It was considered to be a faulty logic. They couldn't solve many of these paradoxes. They didn't know how to solve them, but they pretty much just discounted them and said, they have no room. What does that do to your mythology? What does that do to how you understand, as Freud did, that mythology is really describing the human psyche? You end up with a psyche that is void of paradox as well. So if you turn to Greek mythology to capture the workings of the psyche, you end up with a psyche that is void of paradox. There are wars going on. The gods are fighting one another. They're in a constant battle. But there's no ability to sustain opposite forces at the same time. But in Judaism, this becomes one of the great staples. What was one of the things that happened after we won, I'll put this in quotes, the battle against the Greek way of thinking? Well, the main thing I think that everybody knows is that we took from the Greeks the way that they reasoned logically, but we added to it a very important element that they didn't have. And it's called Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim. That these and these, even though they contradict and are opposite opinions, are the words of the living God. Whenever there's a dispute in Torah, we don't say that one side is right and the other is wrong, which is the conclusion you should come to if there's no paradox. Rather, we say both are right. How can you say that they're both right? It can either be treif or kosher. It can either be permissible or not. It can either be this way or that way. How can you say that they're both correct? That is the secret of the paradox within Torah. That even within Torah, at the very beginning of this change and victory over Greek logic, came the idea that if you're really going to be representing the words of God, you have to be able to sustain opposite opinions and accept that both are true. Now, interestingly enough, there's a name for this today in philosophy. This is called dialetheism. So aletheism, ale means alethi, in Greek means truth. So when you say dialetheism, you're saying that two opposing statements are both true. Or as we would say in modern logic, Q and not Q. Or P and not P, depending on whether you studied, if you studied the Hebrew or you went to Johns Hopkins. It's both true and its opposite statement is true. So this is treif, and there's a reasoning that says this is kosher, and they're both true. Of course, in practice, you can't do both, because the world itself doesn't lend itself very well to doing paradoxes. So you have to decide in the end, which opinion are you going to follow in practice. But in terms of the reasoning sustains both, and both are considered to be correct. So this is in terms of the intellect. But I said that this has a lot of ramifications, not just in terms of the intellect. Where else is this important? Well, what about how we treat other people? Should paradox have some kind of effect and influence on how we see other people. We said before that Jerome of Stridon, when he saw the verse that David said, "And in my haste," or in my rashness, "I proclaimed that all men are deceitful," he immediately took it at face value. And he made it into a universal. All men are always deceitful. And from that he got to the idea that the liar paradox is in that verse. But how do we see it? Do we see it the same way? Do we see that there's no other option but that people are always deceitful? Or are we more complex in our understanding of people? So there's an incredible verse, which I'm going to bring up now, for myself, first of all, to remember. It's in Job. And the verse says, this is Job 11:11, if I'm not mistaken. Let me make sure. For some reason, can't find it at the moment. Just one second. Yes, okay. Vayal Avin. Just a moment. It's Job 11:11. I want to read it in the translation. I thought I had written it down to save time, but for some reason I didn't. Job 11:11. Let's see. Okay. So I'm going to use one of the English translations. Surely he knows the deceit of men. If he sees iniquity, he does not take note. Meaning he doesn't notice it. Now it's very interesting. If you look at the different translations of Job 11:11, you'll find that there are those who translate this as a question. Does he not take note? Again, he, meaning God, he sees the iniquities of men. And there's two ways to read it in Hebrew. Either he does not take note, or does he not take note? So the reading that would read it as a question says, can God ignore the fact that there are iniquities in men? Deceit, and so on. So what did we just hear from the sages? That not only does he know it, he also ignores it. And when the angels who said he's full of deceit, man, don't create him, when they were arguing this, what did God do? He left them to argue with loving kindness, and he went off and created man. So he ignored deceit. In Chassidus, this becomes perhaps the most important power that we have in dealing with other people. So instead of reading it that he, being God, we should read it about ourselves. So we see deceit in other people and we ignore it. But in Chassidus, it's taken a level further. Because if you see the deceit in man, specifically if you see the deceit in another Jew, what should you do? What's the answer? Well, the simple answer is when you see deceit in your child, for instance. If your child is deceiving you, what should be the response? You might say, you should hate deceit. You should hate falsehood. Whenever it creeps up, wherever it's creeping up, stamp it out. But this verse from Job is actually saying it's exactly the opposite. Not only should you ignore it, you actually have to love the child more. It's an amazing observation. That if you want to get rid of the deceit, you actually have to play with a paradox. The more deceit there is, the more truthfulness you have to exhibit, the more love you have to show. And so paradox becomes the most important power of the psyche. The ability to see something and act not only by ignoring it, but by doing exactly the opposite of what you saw should have made you do. This becomes the staple of every Hasidic master. Each one had a different saying about this. The most famous is Reb Pinchas of Koretz, who is well known to have said that to love a small Rasha, somebody who's only minorly wicked, even a small minor tzaddik can. But to love the consummate wicked man, there has to be the consummately righteous tzaddik. Only he has the power, enough paradoxical power, to be able to contain these two. I want to stress this a little bit more. When you think about it, one would say maybe this is just a educational trick. It goes well beyond that, because if I have, like Pinchas of Koretz, have trained myself for years to not be able to utter a single false statement or do something without meaning it, imagine how sensitive I would become to any kind of deceit. You learn to hate deceit in the way that you learn to hate anything that's wrong. How can you come to love someone who's acting deceitfully? How, even if it's your child, you still hate the deceit. The answer is that you can't. You still hate it. But you carry opposites. You carry the two feelings at once. That's why the paradox is so important here. Because the recognition that my child or this other person is being deceitful awakens hatred, real hatred of the deceit. But that itself, like we said about the dynamic of the liar paradox, it awakens my compassion, my love for this person, because of what they are carrying with them. That they are stooped in deceit, that they've become the lie itself. That itself awakens the compassion. That itself awakens the love to redeem that person, to try to bring them out of that state. That becomes the paradox of the psyche and the paradox of feeling. In fact, this is so pronounced and so powerful that in the Tanya, for instance, at the end of chapter 34 that we just were learning last week, at the end of chapter 34, he writes the following. He says, in chapter 34, he described all kinds of types of joy that come from doing mitzvot, from doing commandments. But then at the end he writes, all the specific types of joy enumerated above do not preclude one from being shamed and despised in his own eyes, or from having a broken heart and a humble spirit, even at the very time of his joy. So I'm receiving joy from performing the mitzvah. And yet at the same time, I'm not just aware, but I'm also capable of despising what's wrong with me, even in myself. The paradox goes that deep. It's not just about the other person, even in myself. For the shame and so on is prompted by one's awareness of the lowliness of his body and animal soul. Why? Because I'm not just living the paradox of being spiritual and physical, but even within my spirit, there's a paradox called my animal soul and my divine soul. And they also create a paradox. While his joy is felt on account of his divine soul. So because of my animal soul, which even when I'm in the middle of doing a mitzvah, I'm still thinking of all my different cravings and all the things that I would do wrong if just given the opportunity. Even in the middle of doing a mitzvah, I'm still there because my animal soul is not changed. It's still capable of doing these things. As mentioned above in chapter 31, we find a similar statement in the Zohar. Weeping is lodged in one side of my heart, and joy is lodged in the other. They coexist together in a paradoxical state. It's that paradoxical state that is the core of existence. Now we can begin to understand what happens in this week's Parsha. How can a people that has just experienced, all of them, the level of prophecy of Moses, the level of prophecy that there is none like it, where you see the infinite within the finite, where you hear the infinite talking to you. How can a people who experience that turn around and become idol worshippers? Which is the topic of this week's Parsha. The sin of the golden calf is described in Parshas Ki Tisa. The Parsha that we said begins with this word tisa, which is like the carrying of opposites. The answer is that the fact that we have a higher self, the divine soul, which is a part of God above, doesn't preclude the fact that we're also made of our physical selves that has a spiritual side, the animal soul. And the animal soul is still the animal soul. It's still the lower self. And it still acts and operates the way it always has. There's no way to change it. It's not going away. So we live in a paradoxical state. And it depends what comes up. If I have an opportunity to do a mitzvah, my divine soul runs to it. If I have an opportunity to sin, my animal soul runs to it. And I'm constantly locked in this paradox. If I can't accept the paradox of myself, I will go crazy. I won't be able to forgive myself also. But I also won't be able to believe that I'm capable of doing great things. I have to accept the paradoxical state. Now, it doesn't have to be between good and bad things necessarily. It can also be in keeping interest in what I'm doing. Because I am multifaceted. If I go too deep into the spiritual and it stops interesting me, I have a physical side. I can take the other side of the paradox. If I'm looking at the negative in the world, I can look at the positive. I can use paradox to keep myself on my toes. That's why it's called the pulse of life. Because it can always switch. You can always switch to a different way of looking at things. And they exist together at the same time. It's just said that in God, the paradox is sustained at the same time. By us, the two sides of the paradox can exist one after another. We can't sustain them together, but we can focus on one after the other. Why is this all possible? Because the big innovation of the Baal Shem Tov was to go what's called before the first contraction. The first contraction, as he explained, is what set up the rules of logic, which is why the Greeks could not accept paradox. The Greeks could not accept paradox because in a logical system, it's either true or false. It can't be both. It's either one or the other. That's in a logical system. But before the first contraction, which is called the tzimtzum, the first contraction, the limiting of God's infinite light, everything was possible. There were no limits on logic. So for instance, how far does this go? That you could have a 5-sided triangle. How can you have a triangle with 5 sides? A triangle by definition has 3. That's true in our logical scheme. That's true in the way that we define things. But by God, before the first contraction, which is not a state that was a long time ago, rather that's the nature of the infinite always. It's always possible to have a 5-sided triangle with, with 1,000 degrees for all its angles. The innovation of the Baal Shem Tov's understanding was that we can tap into that reality that's before the first contraction even now. We go beyond the finite and enter the infinite. We don't do it because it's a curiosity, said the Baal Shem Tov. We do it because this is what sustains, this is the pulse of life. I didn't want to finish with him, but it turned out this way. I wanted to finish with something that Søren Kierkegaard said about paradox. This is in his philosophical fragments. He said like this, "But one must not think ill of the paradox, for the paradox is the passion of thought, and the thinker without the paradox is like the lover without passion, a mediocre fellow. But the ultimate potentiation of every passion is always to will its own downfall. And so it is also the ultimate passion of the understanding to will the collision between the two sides of the paradox. Although in one way or another the collision must become its downfall. So on the one hand, paradox ruins logic, and yet logic wants paradox. This then is the ultimate paradox of thought. To want to discover something that thought itself cannot think." So Kierkegaard said this in terms of the mind. We say it also in terms of feelings, like we read from the Zohar, that crying and laughter can be wedged in the heart in a paradoxical state. It's the way that we relate to other people and the way that we relate to God. So this is not just as Kierkegaard says, an intellectual exercise. It's not just something that frees us intellectually, but it's also something that builds our emotions and builds our theology. I want to end with one final thing, so that I don't end with Kierkegaard. It's told about Rabbi Yonasan of Eibschitz. I don't know how you say Eibschitz in the German, but it said a little bit different. In any case, he was very close to a nobleman that was the Duke of Eibschitz. And he was also a jeweler, Rabbi Yonasan. That's what he made his living from. So the Duke invited him one day, and he said, we're good friends. We've been good friends for a long time. And you're a wise man. I want you to give me a present that whenever I look at it, if I'm happy, I'll be sad. And if I'm sad, I'll turn happy. So you have 3 days. We're good friends, but don't test my friendship. So Rabbi Yonasan went home and he thought a long time, what should I bring him? So after 3 days he came to him, to this Duke, and he brought him a ring. And the Duke looked at it and said, that's it? This, when I look at it, is going to turn it with, you cast a spell on it, so that when I look at it, if I'm sad, I'm going to be happy, and when I'm happy, I'm going to be sad. He said, Your Highness, you have to look more carefully. So put the ring on your finger and look at it carefully. So he looks at it, and inside he sees, in the tiniest writing are etched the words, "This too shall pass." That's the nature of paradox that gives the pulse of life. Everything passes. But paradoxically, it's true for both the joyful moments and the sad moments. Because life is made out of both. But what you want to be able to do through paradox is to be able to progress and to switch from one to the other, to remain dynamic, to have a pulse, to feel that you can change. And so in that sense, paradox becomes the agent, the fuel, the engine that keeps change alive in life and keeps the pulse going. Okay, so if there's any questions I saw before, somebody let me see if I can open the, okay. So if anybody wants to speak, or the thing we didn't do last time, and if anybody wants to, this is a good opportunity. If you want to introduce yourself, turn the camera on, and then we can say hello. So that's another thing we can do, especially if I don't know who you are. Okay, Vince.
Vince is Chava.
Right. Yeah, but
currently located in Mississippi.
Okay.
Wanted to.
It's very nice to meet you. Where in Mississippi? Can you tell us?
Oh, outside of Jackson, right outside of Jackson, Madison.
Okay.
Via Colorado and Baltimore, but and might be heading to Florida. So who knows? What kept coming to me toward the end of this, the idea of how do you live with this paradox, to me is the teaching of Tomer Dvorak, right?
Which you'll have to share now.
So the idea of Hashem's, ability to withstand constant, so to speak, He's giving us every breath, and with that breath that He's giving us, we're using it to
sin.
do something not right to sin, but in the same time, he just keeps giving us back that breath.
Right.
You know, so it's that teaching of,
Right.
you know, that helps us live through the paradox and want to live through the paradox.
So what you're saying is that's what the Tomer Dvorah begins with. It's the very first chapter, and he was the beginning. It was written by Rabbi Moses Cordovero. He was the very beginning of Kabbalah in the sense of using the paradox to uncover deeper and deeper meaning, deeper and deeper intellectual understanding of reality. And one of the things that was always a theological question was, how can God allow something negative to exist? And says the Kabbalist in him, he was also a philosopher. As a philosopher, he didn't have an answer to that question. As a Kabbalist, he suddenly had the answer. And the answer was that God sustains paradoxes. And that's part of it, right? So yes, it's a great example. It's one of the most important stations along the development of using paradox. Of course, in Chassidus, again, the stress is more on our relationship with ourselves and with other people and with God, and not so much theological questions like, how can there be sin in the world? Or how can there be evil? But it's true that it also answers, or at least gives some basis for understanding these big questions. Right? Thank you very much, Chava. Toby, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi.
Hello.
Let me get you on camera here on the screen. Okay, there you are. A lot of food for thought today, and I have a number of questions. One, as always, as a parent, and another one because I'm always thinking and reading these days about science and the reality of the world according to physics and astrophysics. So I'll start with that question, and I'm just wondering if you think that there's an inherent paradox in the physical world also, or in our world, where science tells us one thing about the world's creation and the time that we've been here and so on and so forth. And we have the Masorah that we have from the Torah, and they don't always line up. I'm reading the books of Gerald Schroeder, if you're familiar with Professor Schroeder. So I'm just wondering if you think that, I'm trying to frame it because it's troubling, and can you frame it as a paradox inherent in the created physical world?
So in Schroeder's books themselves, he builds a lot on paradox, because there's a lot of paradox within science today. The difference between our science and the science of even the 19th century is that our science contains paradox already. We can't get away from it. We have paradoxes left and right, beginning with special relativity, going into general relativity and quantum mechanics. Paradox is just built in. We have no way of escaping from it. So whether these paradoxes can help bridge a gap.
That wasn't my question. The question is,
let me try to answer still. I'll explain. So, first of all, you have to. That's one of the big things that science today has to acknowledge paradoxes. There's no other way to go about it. It's just built in. So there's no question today that there are paradoxes in reality. Okay. Now, can these paradoxes be used to claim, for instance, that the way that we look at the world from the Torah point of view versus the way that we look at the world from the scientific point of view are two sides of a paradox? Can we argue something like that? So that becomes a much larger question that we've dealt with in length in a book called Wisdom, Integrating Torah and Science. And the answer in short is yes and no. It's a paradoxical answer.
Unsurprisingly.
Yeah. I don't want you to go away. You know, I was going to start with this anecdote, but I think I forgot it in the beginning. First time I was in Los Angeles was in something like 1995. And I met a very dear friend, a man who became a very, very close friend of mine. But the first time I met him, he had been influenced a lot by the Kabbalah Center. He was Russian, and in Los Angeles they have a large following in the Russian community. So I started talking to him about what Chassidus is, and I began presenting paradox. I really haven't presented the most important paradoxes in Chassidus. I've only presented the ones that have to do with psychology. But I began with him. He's an engineer. So I began with those that have to do with science, that are more in terms of how the world works. More like this, expanding on Xenos paradox that we talked about. And his response was shocking. It was the first time I heard this. I never thought to relate the two. But he said to me, that's all just doublespeak. You follow what I'm saying? It's doublespeak. Like you're saying one thing and then you're saying the opposite thing. There's no meaning to what you're saying. It's just ridiculous.
Regarding what?
I was explaining some paradox inherent in reality. It doesn't really matter. But he called it doublespeak, meaning that all you're doing is you're making one claim and then you're turning around and just flipping it. And you're not sustaining the two at the same time. I was very surprised because he's an engineer, so he's a guy who knows, I think, a little bit of physics, and he knows how much. But being an engineer, he likes everything to be very solid. You can't say that the that the bridge is here and it's not here at the same time. That doesn't work. That won't work. So I don't want you to come away feeling with a feeling that what we've been saying is doublespeak, like that you treat your child one way and then the next minute you treat him a different way. There has to be consistency. But the consistency itself can stem, how I treat people can stem from how I understand paradox. That people are walking paradoxes. So even if it looks to me like somebody is ill, they're not well, when I understand that they are a paradox, I can understand that they're also healthy. And it just depends on what I'm going to strengthen. What am I going to acknowledge more? And that becomes you could say this about any doctor. A doctor who really knows what he's doing is constantly encouraging the health in his patient. He's aware that there's also sickness here. But what do you acknowledge? What do you stress? What do you focus on? You can focus on the positive because it also exists there. It's also there. Okay?
Well, if I could.
Okay, so let's move on. Okay, Toby, we'll move on. Avner.
Yeah.
Hi. Good to see you.
Shalom Aleichem.
Aleichem.
Same here. I'm not sure if I'm going to come through so well. Right now, I'm just kind of cutting in and out a little bit because I'm on the road. But I wanted to just mention that to me that my experience of paradox is only an experience. I hear the shir and it's great, it's fantastic. The only way I can get to it, it seems, or I think, I don't know, this must be for everybody, I imagine, because the Chassidus, when you put yourself into it, and I guess with my unrectified imagination, I'm thinking that I'm learning Soviv and Mamala, and we're back and forth, and the Rebbe is telling us one thing or another, whichever mimer it is, and we're trying to hold sway with it, and it feels like a seesaw, a pendulum, and I feel that's where the copying the paradox is that moment of experience, and occasionally there's a hergish, and that's and I hope I'm not fooling myself. That's my comment.
I'm in the same boat. I also hope I'm not fooling myself.
Well, but would you agree though? That's where that it has to come down to an experience. I don't think it's something we can talk about it today in intellectual words. I mean, to say that it does make sense that it is double speak when we're just talking about it. I mean, to live the paradox,
right?
Even we have again, like the Zohar says, the sadness and the happiness, and both lodged different sides of the heart. To have them meld together has to be just that. Seems like an instantaneous moment that doesn't really. We can't live with that constantly.
Right.
Because I think I don't know if we can. I mean, hope we can. Maybe a Mashiach has to come, and then we can.
So I said before that the difference between us and God is that God lives both sides at the same time. We can only live them one after another. But the way that we know that we're living both is that, again, we feel alive, that there's a pulse vibrating through us all the time. So even when I'm stuck on something, I can flip to the other side. I always have a way out. I always have a way of looking at it from the opposite side. Whether it's when I have to reprimand my children, or whether it's when I have to deal with a neighbor, or I have to deal with my parents, or whatever it is, I can always see the other side of things, and that means that I've integrated enough into myself this understanding that life is paradoxical. I think that you're right. It has to come down to behavior in the end. It has to come down to an approach, how I see things. And to sustain a paradox is almost like to sustain judgment. It's like saying, I may be seeing right now one side of the picture, and in a moment the other side is going to come into relief. I'm going to see something completely different, which I missed until now. I couldn't see it. And that's almost like looking at something and bringing it out. So that if I know that concealed within this difficult situation, there's also God's goodness, that allows it to come out. But I have to sustain it in myself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
With regard to action, though, it isn't a basic embodiment within our tradition by living by the, so to speak, the decree of giving everybody the benefit of the doubt.
Right.
That in and of itself is an actual action of manifestation of living a paradox, isn't it? Because we don't really know so much of the time where another person is coming from, but when there is more information, then the whole story, like you said, has flipped. But if you're being presented with something and yet you can see it from the backside first instead of what's being presented at you, which is essentially giving people the benefit of the doubt, then that's a manifestation of living that. Except
I would call it giving the benefit of the paradox. Instead of giving them the benefit of the doubt, the benefit of the paradox. Meaning I'm not oblivious to what's wrong. But I'm also just as much aware of the other side of it that can come out just as well. In therapy, this is the most important thing. Again, like I said, by a doctor. If a doctor has a very difficult job, because on the one hand, he or she is entrusted with battling the disease, and yet to the patient you have to keep showing that you're all encouragement, that it's all going to be good, that you're healthy. You are healthy. We're going to remove the disease, but you are healthy. And that has to be the basis of everything. Yes, Ilana? If you raised your hand.
That rooster, the guy thinks he's a rooster, and the rabbi gets under or the pathologist, or whoever you want, gets under the table, and
Right.
he's also a rooster, and it's like, that's not actually relating to the falsehood in other.
Yes.
That's not even related
Yes.
to.
Yes. I see what you're saying. So there's a famous story from Reb Nachman about the turkey. This young nobleman decided that he went crazy and he thought he was a turkey, so he was under the table collecting scraps. He was naked, and nobody could heal him until eventually this wise man came, and he took his clothing off and he got under the table with him. And when he got under the table, he started collecting scraps like the nobleman's son. And slowly they got to be friends. So he eventually they started talking between them. He says, "Yeah, I'm a turkey just like you." And as they got to be closer and closer, he said, turkeys don't always have to collect scraps. Sometimes we can go above the table and eat from the top of the table. And turkeys don't always have to not wear clothing. We can sometimes wear clothing also. And slowly, as he got to be closer and closer to him, the nobleman's son began to dress and to sit at the top of the table and began to act like a human being. The question at the end of the story is, so when he healed him, did he really stop being a turkey, or is he just a turkey acting like a human being? Is he really healthy now? And that becomes a lingering question. Is he really healed, or is it just that he's been able to condition him to behaviorally act like a human being? In that sense, what Reb Nachman is capturing is the paradox of all our existence. So which am I? Am I the animal soul or the divine soul? Am I an animal soul that just dressed up as a divine soul? So the answer really is that we're both. We remain a turkey, and yet we can also act like human beings. And we have both of them inside us. And both of them exist.
Why does appealing to the sheker in somebody help them?
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Say again?
Putting somebody to the sheker help them.
There is because sometimes you need like to cure like, meaning you have to find somebody who's like you. It's a very basic thing in all therapy that there has to be a measure of trust, and not just trust, but understanding, that I understand what you're going through. If I can't understand what you're going through, you can never really connect to me, and I can never lead you out of the darkness. I have to experience what you're experiencing. This we've talked about many times as the reason that it's so hard to be a Rebbe, because the Rebbe has to experience everything that people that are coming to him are experiencing. So if somebody is going through some kind of pain, he has to be able to experience it in some way. And that creates the trust that... Okay.
On a philosophical level, even a great man, Thomas Coffin, if nobody else deal with a church guy, even a great Thomas Coffin, would have to embrace Sheker in order to help him.
To some
That's
extent.
paradox.
Right. That was what Aaron Cohen did. Whenever he brought two people together, he told a lie, a sort of lie, a white lie as it's called. And it said that God forgives for this because he's willing to have his name even erased in order to bring peace to the world.
So one could say that you can't, if you have somebody in front of you needs help and they're not at their level yet, you can't even tell them yet about loneliness. It's about them.
Right.
You have to actually.
Sometimes you can't say right away. You first have to win their trust, and for that you need to do many things first.
That could take like years.
Sometimes it does. I'm always fond of the movie Broken Wings, where it took 7 years almost to break through the barriers of a woman who was schizophrenic, catatonic schizophrenic, and it was all just a matter of building trust.
If you're a Jewish psychologist sometimes, or you be to start an ethics, whatever it is, sometimes you have to just put that aside and do regular.
And do? I didn't hear you.
Normal psychology, because you just can't tell them that they have some higher part to them, so they're not there.
If you believe that it'll help, maybe you should, but it's hard to see how. Again, the whole difference is that in Western psychology, the main thing is acceptance, and in Jewish psychology, there's not acceptance of everything. Doesn't mean we accept everything, but in order to love and to care for the person, you have to be able to sustain the paradox. That as much as they're sick, they're also healthy. And what needs to be removed will be removed eventually. What needs to be purged will be purged. But I believe in your health. I believe that you're also healthy.
But when you say that they're healthy, you're talking about their higher self, their God self.
Right.
And if they're way more identified with the ego. Instead of kill the ego.
I also identify more with my ego than with my higher self. And yet yeah.
But you want that you can identify with something else. And you're happy to try loneliness in order to get there. But so the whole thing is that especially if you're trying to hold on to the ego, you're trying to come to take over. But it's cross purposes.
Again, if you need to have a plan, like the wise man who goes under the table, he doesn't want to leave the guy at Turkey. He wants to get him out of there. But he himself has to do all kinds of things to win his trust. But he has a plan.
You have to spend 6 years pretending you're also Turkey.
Sorry?
You would have to spend 6 years pretending that you're also a Turkey.
Maybe. Maybe.
Wise man.
That's why it requires to really take care of other people, you need a lot of self-sacrifice. It's not an easy thing.
Could I make a comment here?
Yes, please, Carol.
Yes. There's a very interesting old saying, and it's variety is the spice of life.
Okay.
And by variety, could easily say dichotomy.
Okay.
It's on a different end of the scale. And we have this all through our life, night and day, man and woman, and the two of them may not be in contradiction, but they are clearly on the other end of the scales.
Right.
And I think we've all learned to be comfortable with that. And
Right.
it's given us a lot of joy in life. I see no contradiction in this.
Okay. When there's no contradiction, we're used to it. The point here was to try to take the contradictions and say that they're not just variety. They don't just provide spice. They are life itself.
Very good.
I may not have given enough good examples of paradoxes that that Chassidus talks about. Maybe I should mention one more. The paradox of change and not change. On the one hand, everything is God and God is infinite, and therefore nothing is changing. Everything is constant. On the other hand, we're living in a world that's all change. So which is true? They're both true. On the one hand, nothing is changing. It's all the same. On the other hand, it's all different all the time. And that's paradoxical. When we say Shema, when we cover our eyes, we're trying to grab some inkling of the unchanging aspect of reality. We have to cover our eyes to get there. We're trying to get to a place where we can see the unchanging nature of reality. Okay. I think we're going to end now. And thank you very much for joining. I hope to see you next week.
Rabbi, thank you very much.
Hi, John.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Anybody wants to open their their cameras next time is welcome. It makes it a little easier for me, but not necessarily. However you're comfortable. So hope to see everybody next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi. Next time I'll open up my camera. B'ezrat Hashem.
Me too.
Stay out, Moshe. There's a lower hand. I forgot lower. No, I went. Yes. Now, can't eat matzah till Pesach. And we gotta learn to get ready for Pesach now. And start cleaning.